His voice cut through the ballroom's drone like a blade through silk, silencing the violins and the practiced laughter with a single question. "Where is the girl who wrote this?" The man who spoke was Alistair, the Duke of Blackwood, a figure more myth than man, who had not been seen at a society event in a decade. In his gloved hand, he held a letter, its paper yellowed with age, its edges softened by time. A letter I had written 10 years ago, a foolish, childish thing sent to a man long dead. And now his son, the severe and reclusive Duke, stood in the center of my stepmother's grandest social triumph, holding my forgotten heart in his hand. I was in my customary place, a shadow tucked into an alcove behind a wilting potted palm. It was my designated post at these functions, a compromise between my stepmother's desire for my complete absence and my father's weak insistence on my inclusion. I was the color of invisibility, dressed in a gown of muted gray that melted into the damask wallpaper. My sister Rosalind was the sun around which our family orbited. She stood near the Duke now, a vision in rose-gold silk, her beauty so radiant it was almost an act of aggression. My stepmother, Lady Anya, was at her side, her smile a painted, predatory slash. They, like everyone else, were frozen, staring at the Duke and the impossibly old letter he held aloft. "The girl," he repeated, his voice low but carrying with an unnerving authority that brooked no argument. His eyes, the color of a winter storm, swept the room. They were intelligent, perceptive eyes, and I felt a cold dread snake up my spine as they passed over the glittering chandeliers, the stunned faces, the opulent displays of wealth, and began to search the shadowed corners, the forgotten places, the places where I lived. Lady Anya recovered first, her social graces a hardened shield. "Your Grace," she said, her voice like honey laced with glass. "An old letter, how curious. Perhaps it was a childhood folly of my daughter, Rosalind's." She gestured gracefully to my sister, offering her up as the obvious answer to any question of value. The Duke's gaze flickered to Rosalind, a brief, dismissive assessment. "No," he said, the single word a quiet thunderclap. "This was not written by a hand concerned with folly. It was written by a mind concerned with truth." He looked back at the letter, his expression unreadable. "It was sent to my father. It asks why the flying buttresses of the Northern Abbey failed, while those of the Grand Cathedral, employing a similar design, have stood for 500 years. It debates the merits of limestone versus granite in load-bearing columns and includes a rather insightful sketch of a cantilever system." A collective, confused silence fell over the room. The rumors spoke of a monster, a recluse haunted by tragedy. They did not speak of the intensity in his eyes, or the way they seemed to strip away all pretense. "You are Alara?" he asked. His voice was softer now, meant only for me. I could only nod, my throat a knot of tangled fear and disbelief. My hands, hidden in the folds of my gray skirt, were trembling. This was a nightmare, a bizarre, waking dream from which I would surely be shaken awake into my usual gentle misery. He extended his hand, the one holding the letter. "You wrote this." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, a conclusion reached. I found a sliver of my voice. I was a child, Your Grace. It was an impertinence. "It was a work of startling insight," he corrected me, his tone precise. "My father kept it. He was drafting a reply when he died." He paused, and for a fleeting moment, a flicker of some deep, ancient pain crossed his features. "I found it this morning among his most valued papers. I've been looking for its author all day." The world tilted on its axis. My stepmother's carefully constructed evening was in ruins. All her plans to dazzle the Duke with Rosalind's beauty had been undone by a ghost from the past, by a forgotten letter from the forgotten daughter. Lady Anya's face was a mask of fury, her smile frozen in a terrifying rictus. She saw her ambitions turning to ash. I saw something far more frightening. In the Duke of Blackwood's gaze, I saw a glimmer of something I had been taught I was not worthy of: respect. And that, more than any public humiliation, was the most terrifying thing of all, because it felt like hope, and hope was a prison I had long since escaped. The aftermath of the ball was a quiet storm. Lady Anya did not scream or rage. Her fury was a cold, compressed thing, far more dangerous than any tempest. She confined me to my rooms, not as a punishment, but as a strategic maneuver, to keep me out of sight while she attempted to salvage her plans. My father, Lord Valerius, wrung his hands and offered me apologetic, useless glances, his spine having long ago dissolved under the heat of his wife's ambition. Rosalind, to her credit, seemed more bewildered than anything else. She brought me my supper tray, her brow furrowed. "I don't understand," she said, setting the tray on a small table. "He's the Duke of Blackwood. Everyone says he's a beast. Why would he care about some old letter about rocks and buildings?" "I don't know," I whispered, staring at the wall. My mind kept replaying the moment his eyes had found me in the darkness. It felt like being struck by lightning. "Anya is furious," Rosalind continued, oblivious to the tremor in my hands. "She says you've ruined everything." She had hoped he might notice me. She said it without malice, a simple statement of fact. In Rosalind's world, being noticed by a duke was the purpose of a woman's existence. That he had noticed me for my mind was a concept so alien it simply did not compute. 2 days passed in suffocating silence. I was a ghost in my own home, a problem to be managed. On the third morning, a footman, his face pale with shock, announced that a carriage bearing the Blackwood crest had arrived. An invitation was delivered, not to my father, not to Lady Anya, but to me. It was a simple, stark white card, embossed with a silver wolf's head. It requested my presence at Blackwood Manor that afternoon, to continue a discussion of mutual architectural interest. It was signed simply, Blackwood. My stepmother's control finally snapped. She snatched the card from my hand, her nails digging into my wrist. "This is absurd," she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. "A trick, a cruel joke. He is toying with you, with us, to make a point about his own eccentricity." "I must go," I said, the words surprising me with their firmness. A tiny, defiant ember had been kindled in the desolate landscape of my soul. He had seen me. He had spoken to me with respect. I would not, could not hide in the shadows again. "You will do no such thing," she spat. "You will write a polite refusal, plead a headache. You are a plain, awkward girl, Ilara. What could a man like that possibly want with you? He will take one look at you in the daylight and be repulsed. You will humiliate this family." Each word was a familiar stone, worn smooth from years of being used to build the walls of my prison. Plain, awkward, a humiliation. I had always believed her. But the Duke's eyes had seen something else. He had seen a mind. "No," I said, pulling my wrist from her grasp. There were no portraits of ancestors on the walls, only architectural drawings and renderings, framed in simple black wood. The air smelled of old paper, beeswax, and rain-soaked earth. It was the most calming place I had ever been. The library was a cathedral of books. 2 stories of floor-to-ceiling shelves soared into a vaulted darkness, with a rolling ladder leaning against one wall like a silent attendant. In the center of the room, by a vast stone fireplace where a low fire crackled, sat the Duke. He was not dressed in formal attire, but in a simple dark shirt and trousers, his sleeves rolled to his forearms. He rose as I entered. "Miss Ilara," he said, his voice the same low resonance I remembered. "Thank you for coming." "Your Grace," I managed, curtsying as I had been taught. My heart was a frantic bird beating against the cage of my ribs. He gestured to a worn leather armchair opposite his own. "Please, there is no need for such formality here." He waited until I was seated before resuming his own seat. Between us was a low table, and on it, laid open, were several large, heavy books. "And my letter." "I must apologize," he began, "for the scene I caused at your home. It was not my intention to create a spectacle." "You are a duke, Your Grace," I said softly. "Your mere presence is a spectacle." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, a fleeting, startling expression that transformed his severe face. "A fact I find deeply inconvenient. which is why I rarely venture out." His eyes found the letter. My father was not just a duke, he was an architect. It was his life's true passion, a passion the title forced him to abandon. He believed buildings had souls, that they were living things shaped by human need and natural law. He looked at me then, his gaze direct and searching. "When I read your letter, I did not hear the voice of a child. I heard his voice. The same questions, the same obsession with integrity, with why things stand and why they fall." I was speechless. The connection I had felt, the kinship with a man I had never met, was not a fantasy. It was real. "Tell me," he said, leaning forward slightly, his intensity a palpable force. "You theorized that the failure at the Northern Abbey was not due to the buttresses, but to the foundation, a weakness in the soil composition that was exacerbated by a shift in the water table. What made you think of that?" And so I told him. The fear and nervousness dissolved, replaced by the pure, clean joy of intellectual engagement. I spoke of the books I had read, the subtle clues in the monastic chronicles about flooding in the lower chapels, the way the cracks in the surviving masonry suggested a shearing force from below rather than a compressive force from above. He listened, truly listened, his head tilted, his eyes never leaving my face. He did not seem to notice that my dress was gray and unfashionable, that my hair was not styled in the latest mode, or that I was not a celebrated beauty like my sister. He saw the person who had written the letter. He countered with his own theories, pulling a heavy folio from the table and opening it to a diagram of the Abbey's floor plan. He pointed to a section of the wall. "Here," he said, his finger tracing a line. "This wall was a later addition. It interrupted the original drainage culvert. Your water table theory would support the idea that the blockage caused hydrostatic pressure to build against the northern foundation." His finger was close to mine on the page. I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin, a startling jolt of awareness in the cool, book-dusted air. I drew my hand back, a blush rising to my cheeks. He seemed not to notice, or if he did, he was kind enough to ignore it. We talked for 2 hours. We talked of Roman concrete, of Gothic arches, of the simple elegance of a well-made dovetail joint. It was the most exhilarating and honest conversation of my entire life. As the light began to fade outside the tall library windows, he fell silent, looking at me with that same unreadable expression from the ballroom. "Your stepmother does not value you," he stated, as simply as if he were observing the weather. The words hung in the air between us. It was a truth so fundamental to my existence that I had never heard it spoken aloud. It was like someone naming the air. She has my sister's interests at heart," I stammered, the old habit of defending my keepers dying hard. "Her interests, perhaps," he said, his voice hardening almost imperceptibly. "Not your sister's, and certainly not yours." He stood, signaling the end of our meeting. I had a fire lit in the small conservatory. It can be chilly waiting for a carriage. "Mrs. Gable will bring you some tea." He walked me to the library door. As I stepped past him, he said my name. "Ilara." I turned. The firelight cast his face in bronze and shadow, making him seem like a figure from an old legend. "You are not a quiet, bookish thing," he said, quoting my stepmother's dismissive words. "You are a formidable intellect. Do not let anyone, ever again, convince you otherwise." I fled to the conservatory in a state of emotional turmoil, his words echoing in my soul. The room was a small glass dome filled with ferns and the scent of damp earth. A warm fire blazed in a small hearth, and a single chair was drawn up before it. It was a gesture of profound, unexpected kindness. As I waited, I saw that a thick woolen shawl had been draped over the back of the chair. It was not the act of a monster. It was the act of a man who paid attention, a man who saw me. And as I wrapped the shawl around my shoulders, I wept. We fell into a comfortable rhythm, our conversations weaving through history, philosophy, and always back to the language of stone and structure that we both understood so deeply. "Alistair," He insisted I call him Alistair when we were alone, was a man of profound stillness, but his mind was a restless, brilliant thing. He would listen for an hour without speaking, his gaze fixed on my face as I explained a complex theory, and then he would ask a single, incisive question that would unravel my entire argument and force me to rebuild it on a stronger foundation. He challenged me, he respected me, and in doing so, he taught me to respect myself. One rainy afternoon, as we were examining blueprints for a bridge his father had designed but never built, he spoke of the past. He was consumed by this project in his final months, Alistair said, his voice quiet, his finger tracing the elegant curve of a suspension arch. He used to say that a bridge isn't about crossing a river, it's about connecting two worlds that were meant to be one. He looked up from the plans, but his eyes were distant, seeing a memory. The day he died, the stonemasons sent word that there was a flaw in the granite quarried for the main pier. He rode out in a storm to see for himself. There was a landslide. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken grief. The severe, controlled Duke was gone, and in his place was a man still haunted by the sudden, violent loss of his father. He had not just lost a parent, he had lost his only intellectual companion, the only other person who spoke his language. The rain lashed against the library windows, but inside, the world had gone still and silent. His thumb brushed over my knuckles, a slow, deliberate movement that sent a shiver through my entire body. He held my gaze, and in the stormy depths of his eyes, I saw not just grief, but something new, something that looked dangerously like affection. The air thickened, charged with a meaning that went far beyond our shared intellectual passions. This was no longer a meeting of minds, it was a meeting of two lonely souls who had found in each other a solace they had never expected. The moment stretched, fragile and perfect, a bridge being built across the chasm of our separate worlds. He held my hand for a moment longer, a silent acknowledgement of the boundary we had just crossed, before gently releasing it. He did not smile, but the severity in his face had softened, replaced by a look of profound, weary tenderness. A near smile that was more intimate than any I had ever received. He had shared his deepest wound with me, and I, in my small way, had offered what little comfort I could. The foundation between us had been tested, and it had held. From that day on, the nature of our meetings shifted. The intellectual spark was still there, but it was now underscored by a deep, resonant emotional current. My stepmother was not a fool. Though she could not guess at the depth of our connection, she could see the change in me. I no longer walked with my head bowed, my shoulders slumped in apology for the space I occupied. I met her gaze. I spoke in full sentences. My newfound confidence was to her an act of rebellion. She saw her power over me waning, and it made her desperate. Her plans for Rosalind to make a brilliant match were faltering, overshadowed by the constant gossip about the reclusive Duke and his strange little ward. Lady Anya decided it was time to take decisive, cruel action. Her attack was clever, a poisoned dart aimed at the very heart of my new reality. She did not confront me directly. Instead, she penned a letter to the Duke. I only learned of its contents later, but I could picture her writing it, her pen scratching across the expensive stationery, each word a carefully chosen drop of venom. She wrote as a concerned and loving stepmother. She spoke of my fragile constitution and my vivid imagination. She hinted at a history of mental instability, of fantastical stories and obsessive attachments. She painted my intellectual passions as a symptom of a troubled mind, a retreat from a reality I could not handle. My letter to his father, she suggested, was not the work of a gifted child, but the rambling of a lonely, disturbed one. She then delivered the killing blow. Out of deep concern for my welfare, my father had arranged a marriage for me with a distant cousin, a coarse but steadying country squire who would take me away to the remote countryside where the quiet life would be conducive to my recovery. She ended the letter by thanking the Duke for his charitable interest in me, and by politely but firmly stating that his attentions were no longer required, as they were proving overstimulating to my delicate nerves. A week passed with no word from Blackwood Manor. The carriage did not come. The silence was a suffocating blanket, heavy with my stepmother's triumph. She was kind to me during that week, a cloying, patronizing kindness that was worse than her usual cruelty. She spoke of my upcoming new life in the country as if it were a great gift she had procured for me. My father avoided my eyes, his face a mask of shame and weakness. Rosalind looked at me with pity. I was plunged back into the gray despair I had known my whole life. But it was 1,000 times worse now because I had known the sun. I had known the warmth of respect, the light of true companionship. The hope that Alistair had kindled was dying, and the cold was unbearable. I believed her lies had worked. Why wouldn't they? I was, after all, just a plain, quiet girl. He was a duke. Lady Anya's story, that he had been amusing himself with a curiosity, was so much more plausible than the truth I had dared to believe, that he had seen me and valued what he saw. The prison walls I had just begun to dismantle were being rebuilt around me, thicker and higher than ever before. My heart, which had just learned to beat with a steady rhythm of hope, now hammered with the frantic, trapped terror of a bird in a cage. My brief season of being seen was over. I was invisible once more. On the 8th day of silence, another crested carriage arrived. But this time, the footman did not bring an invitation for me. He brought a summons for my entire family, Lord Valerius, Lady Anya, Miss Rosalind, and me. We were requested at Blackwood Manor that afternoon. No reason was given. Lady Anya was ecstatic. Her face was aglow with victory. "You see," she said to me, her voice dripping with false sympathy as she adjusted the fall of her silk dress. "He wishes to formally thank us and wish you well on your marriage. A final, proper goodbye. It is a sign of his good breeding." She patted my cheek, a gesture of ownership. "Now, do try to look presentable, Alara. We mustn't make him regret his kindness." I felt numb as I dressed in the best of my gray gowns. This was it, the final humiliation. A formal dismissal in front of the family who had engineered my ruin. I would have to stand there, a silent, broken thing, while the man who had shown me what it felt like to be valued politely handed me over to my jailers. The thought was a physical pain, a sharp stone in my chest. The journey was silent. My stepmother hummed a little tune, a sound of pure, unadulterated triumph. My father stared grimly out the window. Rosalind fidgeted with her gloves, sensing the tension but not understanding its source. I simply sat, a statue of despair, counting the beats of my own broken heart. We were shown not to the library, but to the Grand Solar, a formal receiving room I had never seen before. It was a severe, imposing space, dominated by a massive fireplace and tall, unadorned windows that looked out over the bleakly beautiful moors. Alistair was standing before the hearth, his back to us. He was dressed formally in a dark, impeccably tailored coat. He looked every inch the powerful, unapproachable Duke of Blackwood. As we were announced, he turned slowly. His face was a mask of cold fury. The air in the room crackled with it. This was not a man preparing to make polite goodbyes. An imagination that has allowed you to systematically embezzle funds from the dowry left to Alara by her late mother for the past 10 years. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by a sharp gasp from Rosalind. My father looked as if he had been struck. Lady Anya's face contorted, the mask of the gracious lady of the manor melting away to reveal the grasping, vicious creature beneath. "That is a monstrous lie," she shrieked. "Is it?" Alistair's voice remained unnervingly calm. He gestured to a large mahogany desk in the corner of the room. It was covered in ledgers and documents. "When I received your letter, I did not for one moment believe its contents, because I know Alara. But it did make me wonder what kind of woman would go to such lengths to isolate and dispose of her own charge. So I had my solicitors look into your affairs. They are remarkably thorough. They discovered a hidden account. They found records of sold assets. Or were you merely content to live in willful ignorance while your daughter was being systematically erased?" My father flinched, his face crumbling into a mask of pathetic guilt. I did not know the extent." "You knew enough." Alistair cut him off, his contempt palpable. "He had done this for me. He had wielded his immense power not to rescue me, but to arm me with the truth. He had laid the battlefield and disarmed my enemy. But the final confrontation, I suddenly understood, had to be mine. All the years of silence, of swallowing insults, of making myself small and invisible, coalesced into a single point of pure, clarifying anger. Empowered by his defense, I found my voice. I stepped forward, away from the shelter of his presence, to face my stepmother on my own. "Was it worth it?" I asked, my voice clear and steady, echoing in the cavernous room. It was the first time I had ever truly spoken to her as an equal, and the shock on her face was profound. "Your quiet life was built on the foundations of my silence." Finally, I looked at Rosalind, who was openly weeping, her beautiful face streaked with tears. "I do not blame you, Rosalind. You only saw what you were taught to see." My speech was done. The truth was out, laid bare on the cold stone floor of the Duke's solar. Lady Anya stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish, no words coming out. Her power was gone. Her lies were ash. She had been utterly and completely defeated. In that moment, I was not the girl in the gray dress anymore. I was Alara, and I was free. The aftermath of the confrontation was swift and decisive. Alistair, with cold precision, laid out the terms. Lady Anya would be exiled to a remote dower house on the coast, her allowance barely enough for subsistence. The stolen funds would be repaid from her personal effects and the sale of her jewels. My father, shamed and broken, agreed to everything. He would place my mother's entire remaining estate, and indeed his own, under a trust managed by Alistair's solicitors, with me as the sole beneficiary. He was effectively ceding control of his life, a penance for his weakness. Rosalind, to my surprise, came to me as they were preparing to leave. She took my hands, her own trembling. "I am so sorry, Alara," she whispered, her eyes filled with a genuine, dawning horror. "I was so blind. I never saw." In her apology, I saw the first glimmer of a real sisterhood, a bridge being built over the ruins of our family. After they had gone, the great solar fell silent. Only Alistair and I remained, standing on either side of the vast fireplace. The storm of the confrontation had passed, leaving behind a strange, quiet peace. The weight of years of oppression had been lifted from my shoulders. I felt light, almost dizzy with the sudden absence of it. Alistair came to stand beside me, his presence a warm, solid comfort. We stood for a long time, simply watching the flames dance in the hearth, the silence between us no longer a void, but a shared space of understanding. "She will no longer be a threat to you," he said finally, his voice soft. "It wasn't just her," I replied, my gaze fixed on the fire. "It was the belief that I was what she said I was. You gave me the weapons to fight her, Alistair, but you also gave me the courage to fight the ghost of her inside my own head." He turned to face me, his expression serious. "I gave you nothing that was not already yours, Alara. Courage, intellect, integrity, they are the foundation upon which you are built. I simply provided a little light, so you could see the blueprint of your own soul." My heart swelled with an emotion so powerful it was painful. This man, this severe, solitary duke, understood me more profoundly than anyone in my entire life. He had not rescued a damsel in distress. He had recognized the fellow architect and offered her a partnership. "What will you do now?" he asked, his voice laced with an uncharacteristic uncertainty. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "For the first time, I can do anything. I could travel, I could study, I could see the great cathedrals we've only read about." The possibilities were a dizzying, wonderful expanse. "You could," he agreed. He took a step closer, and the space between us became charged, intimate. "Or you could stay." His hand came up, not to touch me, but hovering near my cheek, a gesture of hesitant reverence. "You could stay here, with me, as my wife." The words hung in the air, more shocking than any of the day's revelations. Marriage. It was a word I had never dared to apply to myself. He must have seen the shock on my face, because he rushed to explain, his usual precision giving way to a raw, unvarnished emotion. This is not a proposal of pity or a reward for your suffering. It is a proposal of profound, selfish need. I have been a recluse, not just from grief, but from a world I found shallow and meaningless. A world without substance. You, Elara, you are the most substantial person I have ever met. You see the truth in things. You see the structure beneath the facade. When I am with you, the world is not gray. It has form and line and beauty. He finally let his hand rest against my cheek, his touch gentle, his thumb stroking my skin. I am not offering to rescue you. I am asking you to rescue me from a life of silent observation. I am asking you to be my partner, to argue with me about cantilever bridges and debate the merits of limestone, to build a life with me, a life that will last. Tears welled in my eyes, but for the first time, they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. He was not offering me a title or a fortune. He was offering me himself. He was offering me a home I had only ever dreamed of, built not of stone, but of mutual respect and deep, abiding love. "Alistair," I whispered, my voice thick with tears. "Is that a yes?" he asked, a hint of a genuine smile finally breaking through his severe facade, a sunrise after a long night. "That is a yes," I confirmed, laughing through my tears. He closed the small distance between us and lowered his head, his lips meeting mine. The kiss was not a fiery explosion, but a slow, deep, and certain joining. It was the feeling of a keystone locking perfectly into place, completing an arch that was meant to stand for 1,000 years. It tasted of solitude and sorrow, of old books and wood smoke, and of the profound relief of being, at long last, truly and completely seen. It was the end of a very long winter. 1 year later, I stood on the windswept ridge overlooking Blackwood Manor, a heavy sketchbook in my hands. They were filled with the scratch of pencils on parchment, with lively debates that lasted long into the night, with the comfortable silence of two people who understood each other without words. My mother's dowry, once stolen, was now being used to fund a school for young craftsmen and women, teaching them the arts of stone masonry, carpentry, and design. The shadows of my past had not vanished, but they had been rendered powerless by the bright, steady light of my present. Mrs. Gable, who had become a dear friend, now ran the ducal household with a quiet smile, remarking often on how much more life and laughter there was within the old stone walls. Rosalind visited frequently, her initial awe of my new position slowly giving way to a genuine, warm affection. She was finding her own way, discovering that her worth was not solely dependent on her beauty or her marriage prospects. Even my father, in his quiet country life, seemed to be finding a measure of peace, writing to me of his newfound interest in botany. Later that evening, Alistair found me in our library, the grand, soaring space that had once been his sanctuary and was now our shared heart. I was curled in my favorite leather armchair, a book open in my lap, watching him as he stood by the fire. In his hand, he held a familiar, yellowed piece of paper, my letter. He looked over at me, his eyes soft in the firelight. "Do you know," he said, "I still read this sometimes, to remind myself of the day the world shifted on its axis." I closed my book and went to him, taking the fragile paper from his hands and placing it on the mantelpiece, a relic of a past that had led, miraculously, to this. I wrapped my arms around his waist and rested my head against his chest, listening to the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. "I don't need to read it," I said softly. "I'm living the reply." He held me tighter, his hand stroking my hair. Outside, the wind howled across the moors, but here, in the heart of the home we were building together, surrounded by the quiet hum of a million stories, I was no longer the invisible girl in the corner. I was seen, I was valued, I was loved, and I was finally, truly, home.